Rabbi David Goldstein stood at his study window, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the modest community center that had been his life's work for the past 15 years. The Philadelphia neighborhood of Kensington wasn't known for its beauty, but David saw something different in these streets, lined with row houses and corner stores. He saw potential, resilience, and most importantly, he saw people who needed hope. At 52, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines etched around his kind eyes from years of listening to people's troubles, David had learned that sometimes the greatest acts of faith happened not in synagogues, but in the quiet moments when no one was watching. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in March. David's secretary, Mrs. Rodriguez, knocked on his door with an expression that immediately told him something was wrong. "Rabbi, there's a woman on the phone," she said softly. "She sounds desperate." David had received thousands of such calls over the years. People facing eviction, families without food, children needing school supplies. Each call was a small crisis, but also an opportunity to make a difference in someone's life. The voice on the other end belonged to Elena Martinez, a 73-year-old grandmother who spoke in broken English mixed with rapid Spanish when her emotions overwhelmed her ability to find the right words. Through her tears, she explained that she was about to lose her home, the small row house where she was raising her 3 orphaned grandchildren after their parents died in a car accident 2 years earlier. The mortgage company had filed foreclosure papers, and she had 30 days to come up with $12,000 or face eviction. David listened with the patience that had made him beloved in his community, taking notes as Elena described her situation. She worked 2 part-time jobs, cleaning offices at night and watching neighbors' children during the day. But it wasn't enough to cover the mortgage payments that had become impossible to manage on her fixed income. "I don't know where else to turn, Rabbi," she whispered. "The children, they don't understand. They think we're just moving again." After hanging up the phone, David sat in his chair for a long moment, feeling the weight of Elena's desperation settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He had dealt with countless cases of families facing eviction, but something about Elena's situation struck him with particular force. Perhaps it was the image of 3 children, ages 7, 9, and 12, who had already lost their parents and now faced losing their home. Perhaps it was the grandmother's determination to work 2 jobs at her age rather than give up. Or perhaps it was simply that David recognized a moment when the universe was asking him to do more than offer prayers and sympathy. He pulled Elena's case file and began making phone calls to every resource he knew. The local emergency assistance program had a 6-month waiting list. The county hardship fund had been depleted by the economic downturn that had hit their neighborhood particularly hard. 3 different charitable organizations expressed sympathy, but explained that they didn't have funding for mortgage assistance. Each dead end felt like another weight added to David's chest. He had built his career on finding solutions, on being the person who could navigate bureaucratic systems and connect people with help. This time, the systems were failing. That evening, David drove through Elena's neighborhood, a collection of narrow streets where small houses sat close together and children played on front steps despite the March chill. He found Elena's address, a modest 2-story row house with a small front yard where someone had attempted to plant flowers that were now struggling to survive in the early spring cold. The house needed paint and the front steps required repair, but it was clean and obviously cared for. Through the front window, he could see the warm glow of lights and the movement of small figures that must have been the children. Standing on the sidewalk in the gathering dusk, David felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just another case file or another family in crisis. This was a moment that would define who he was as a rabbi, as a human being, and as someone who claimed to believe that every person mattered. The question wasn't whether he could find a way to help Elena and her grandchildren. The question was whether he was willing to sacrifice what mattered most to him personally to do what he knew was right. The idea came to David at 3 a.m, startling him awake from restless sleep. For 6 months, he had been quietly considering selling the small piece of land his grandfather had left him, 5 acres in the Pocono Mountains, where his family had spent summers for 3 generations. The property held a simple cabin that David's grandfather had built with his own hands after immigrating from Poland, and where David had learned to fish, to appreciate silence, and to understand that some of life's most profound moments happened away from the noise of the city. The land was worth exactly $13,000, according to the most recent appraisal, $1,000 more than Elena needed to save her home. David had been planning to sell it eventually to fund improvements to the community center, but that was a someday plan, not an urgent necessity. Now, lying in his bed and staring at the ceiling, he realized that someday had arrived in the form of 3 orphaned children who deserved stability and a grandmother who deserved to see her sacrifices mean something. But selling the land meant more than just losing a piece of property. It meant giving up the place where he had scattered his father's ashes 5 years earlier, where he went when the weight of his congregation's problems became too heavy to bear alone. It meant losing the physical connection to his grandfather's legacy and the family history that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to survive and rebuild after loss. Most painful of all, it meant abandoning the dream he had shared with his late wife Sarah, that they would retire to the cabin and spend their golden years in the peace of the mountains. Sarah had died of cancer 3 years earlier, and David had planned to honor her memory by preserving the place where they had imagined growing old together. Every time he visited the cabin, he could feel her presence in the kitchen where she had made countless meals, in the bedroom where they had planned their future, in the small garden where she had planted wildflowers that still bloomed each spring. Selling the land would mean losing the last tangible connection to the woman who had been his partner in both life and faith for 28 years. Block 4. David spent the next 3 days wrestling with his decision, seeking guidance through prayer, conversation with trusted colleagues, and long walks through his neighborhood. He called his older brother Michael in California, who responded with predictable shock. "David, that land is all we have left of grandfather's legacy," Michael said. "You can't just give it away for some family you barely know." But David knew that his grandfather, who had fled poverty and persecution in Poland, would have understood the choice. Abraham Goldstein had often told his grandsons that the true measure of a man wasn't what he accumulated, but what he was willing to give away when others needed it more. On Thursday evening, David visited Elena's home to see the children he was considering helping. Elena welcomed him with the mixture of hope and wariness that he recognized in people who had been disappointed too many times. The house was small but immaculately clean, filled with the smell of rice and beans cooking on the stove. 9-year-old Maria was doing homework at the kitchen table, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked through math problems. 7-year-old Carlos was building something elaborate with blocks, and 12-year-old Isabella was helping her grandmother fold laundry while keeping an eye on her younger siblings. "These are my babies," Elena said proudly, introducing each child. David saw immediately how the children looked at their grandmother with absolute trust and love, but also with the slight anxiety that comes from having already lost the people they depended on most. Isabella, the oldest, had the serious expression of a child who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. When David asked about school, she brightened and showed him a report card filled with A's and B's. "I want to be a teacher," she said quietly, "so I can help other kids like us." As David sat in Elena's small living room, sharing the simple dinner she insisted on preparing for him, he realized that he wasn't just being asked to save a house. He was being asked to preserve a family, to ensure that 3 children who had already experienced profound loss wouldn't face another devastating disruption. The cabin in the mountains was a place of memories and peace, but this house was where active love was creating new hope every day. The choice, when viewed that way, wasn't really a choice at all. You're Block 5. On Friday morning, David called the real estate agent who had been periodically asking about his willingness to sell the mountain property. Within an hour, she was at his office with paperwork and a buyer who had been waiting for exactly such a piece of land to become available. The sale could be completed within 2 weeks, she explained, which would give them just enough time to meet Elena's deadline. As David signed the preliminary agreements, his hands trembled slightly, not from uncertainty about his decision, but from the magnitude of what he was giving up. That afternoon, David drove to the cabin one final time before the sale was finalized. The March air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine trees and the promise of spring. He walked through the room slowly, touching the wood that his grandfather had hewn and shaped, standing in the kitchen, where Sarah had hummed while cooking, sitting on the porch, where 3 generations of his family had watched sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. In the bedroom, he found the small wooden box where Sarah had kept letters from her mother, and he tucked it into his jacket to preserve that piece of their shared history. The hardest moment came when he sat in his grandfather's chair, a simple wooden rocker that Abraham had carved during his first winter in America. David could almost hear his grandfather's voice, heavily accented but filled with warmth, telling stories about the old country and the courage it took to build a new life in an unfamiliar place. "Sometimes the greatest blessing is knowing when to let go," Abraham had said during his final illness. "What we keep in our hearts cannot be taken from us, but what we hold too tightly in our hands cannot bless others." As the sun set behind the mountains, David said goodbye to the place that had shaped his understanding of peace, family, and connection to something larger than himself. But as he locked the cabin door for the last time, he felt something unexpected, not loss, but a strange sense of completion. He was honoring his grandfather's legacy not by preserving property, but by living the values Abraham had taught him. The cabin had given the Goldstein family a place to heal and grow. Now it would provide the means for another family to do the same. Block 6. The closing on the land sale took place on a grey Tuesday morning in a lawyer's office downtown. David sat across from the buyers, a young couple planning to build their dream home on the property where his grandfather had built his. They were kind people, and when they learned the story behind David's decision to sell, they promised to preserve the cabin and respect the history of the land. "We have children too," the woman said softly. "We understand what you're doing." Their words provided some comfort, but David still felt a physical ache as he signed away the last piece of his family's original American dream. From the lawyer's office, David drove directly to the mortgage company handling Elena's foreclosure. The payment needed to be certified and processed that day to stop the legal proceedings. David had called ahead to ensure all the paperwork was ready, and the entire transaction took less than an hour. But as he handed over the cashier's check for $12,000, he realized that the financial transaction was only the beginning of what he hoped would be a longer relationship with Elena's family. That evening, David knocked on Elena's door with news that would change everything for her and the children. Elena opened the door, wearing the worried expression he had seen on her face every time they talked. But when she saw his smile, her entire demeanor shifted. "Elena, I have good news," he said simply. "Your house is safe. The mortgage has been paid." Elena stared at him for a long moment, as if processing words in a foreign language. Then she began to cry, not the desperate tears he had heard over the phone, but tears of relief so profound that her entire body shook. The children came running when they heard their grandmother crying, and David had to explain quickly that these were happy tears. 9-year-old Maria threw her arms around David's waist and hugged him with the fierce intensity that only children possess. Carlos began jumping up and down, not fully understanding what had happened, but sensing that something wonderful had occurred. Isabella, always the most serious of the three, looked at David with an expression of adult gratitude that was almost too much for him to bear. "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting us stay home." Block 7. Word of David's sacrifice spread through the community with the speed that news travels in close-knit neighborhoods where people know their neighbors' troubles as well as their own. Mrs. Rodriguez, David's secretary, couldn't hide her tears when she learned what he had done. Members of his congregation began stopping by his office, not with their own problems, but to express their admiration for his choice. The local newspaper heard the story and wanted to write an article, but David politely declined the interview. "This isn't about recognition," he told the reporter. "It's about doing what faith requires when no one is watching." But the impact of David's decision extended far beyond Elena's family. Other families in the neighborhood, inspired by his example, began looking for ways to help each other. Mrs. Johnson, who lived next door to Elena, started a small food pantry in her basement. The corner market owner began extending credit to families facing temporary hardships. The local elementary school principal reached out to David about creating a fund to help children like Isabella, Maria, and Carlos with school supplies and educational opportunities. 3 months after the crisis had been resolved, David received a call from the mayor's office. The city wanted to recognize his contribution to the community with a civic award. Again, David declined, but he used the conversation to advocate for policy changes that would help families avoid foreclosure in the first place. "Recognition is nice," he told the mayor's aide, "but systemic change is what we really need. No one should have to sell family land to save a neighbor's home because our social safety net has holes in it." David's refusal to accept public recognition only increased the respect his community felt for him. People began bringing their most difficult problems to him, not because they expected him to solve everything personally, but because they trusted that he would approach their situations with the same moral clarity he had shown with Elena's family. The small community center where David worked became known throughout Philadelphia as a place where genuine help could be found, where people were treated with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Block 8. 1 year after the sale of his family's land, David received an unexpected phone call that brought tears to his eyes. Isabella, now 13 and even more serious than before, had won a full scholarship to a prestigious private school based on her academic achievements and a personal essay she had written about resilience and family. "I wrote about you, Rabbi David," she told him over the phone. "About how you saved our house, but also about how you showed me that sometimes helping other people is the most important thing you can do." Elena had found full-time work as a school custodian, which provided health insurance for the family and enough income to manage their monthly expenses comfortably. Maria was excelling in her 4th grade classes and had joined the school choir, where her voice had been discovered to be exceptional. Carlos, now 8, was learning to play piano through a community program and showed remarkable talent for someone his age. The stability that David's sacrifice had provided hadn't just saved their home. It had created the foundation for all 3 children to pursue their potential. But perhaps the most significant change was in Elena herself. The desperate, frightened woman who had called David's office that March morning had been replaced by someone who radiated quiet confidence and deep gratitude. She had joined the community center's board of directors and was working to establish an emergency fund that would help other families facing foreclosure. Rabbi David taught me that when someone helps you, the best way to say thank you is to help someone else, she explained to a local television reporter who had discovered their story. The ripple effects of David's decision continued to spread in ways he could never have anticipated. The young couple who had bought his mountain property had established a scholarship fund in his grandfather Abraham's name, providing financial assistance for immigrant children pursuing higher education. Elena's story had inspired other religious leaders throughout Philadelphia to examine their own resources and consider how they might be used to address urgent community needs. Block 9. 2 years after selling the mountain property, David faced an unexpected opportunity that tested his faith in his decision all over again. A former member of his congregation, now a successful real estate developer, offered to purchase 5 acres of comparable mountain land and deed it to David as a gift of appreciation for his community service. The offer was generous and genuine, providing David with the chance to rebuild what he had sacrificed without any financial cost to himself. David spent weeks considering the offer, visiting the proposed property and imagining how it might feel to once again have a mountain retreat where he could find peace and solitude. The land was beautiful, with mature trees and a stream that reminded him of his grandfather's property. He could build a new cabin, create new memories, and perhaps find a way to honor Sarah's memory in a different place. The practical benefits were obvious. He had been working without a break for 2 years, and the stress of constant community engagement was beginning to show in his health and energy levels. But as David walked the boundaries of the offered property, he realized that accepting the gift would fundamentally change what his original sacrifice had meant. The power of his decision to help Elena's family had come not just from the financial assistance, but from the personal cost he had been willing to pay. If he could simply replace what he had given up, the message to his community and to himself would be that sacrifices were temporary inconveniences rather than permanent commitments to living one's values. More importantly, David had discovered that he didn't need the mountain cabin to find peace or connect with his grandfather's legacy. Every time he saw Isabella excelling in school, every time Maria sang in the choir, every time Carlos played piano, he felt the same sense of connection to something larger than himself that he had once found only in the mountains. His grandfather's true inheritance wasn't property, it was the understanding that meaningful life came from meaningful sacrifice. Block 10. David declined the offer of replacement land, but he did so with deep appreciation for the gesture and for what it represented about the kind of community he had helped to foster. Instead of accepting the gift for himself, he worked with the developer to donate the land to a non-profit organization that created summer camps for underprivileged children. The decision felt like a completion of the circle that had begun with his grandfather's immigration story and continued through his own choice to help Elena's family. 3 years after the original crisis, David was invited to speak at Isabella's high school graduation. Now 16, she had maintained her academic excellence while also becoming a leader in community service activities. Her graduation speech focused on the theme of inherited responsibility, not the kind that comes from family wealth or property, but the kind that comes from understanding that each person has an obligation to improve the circumstances of those who come after them. When I was 12 years old, a rabbi I barely knew sold his family's land to save our house, Isabella told the graduating class. He didn't know if we would succeed or fail, if his sacrifice would make a lasting difference, or if we would even remember his kindness. But he taught me that the greatest inheritance you can give someone isn't money or property. It's the belief that they matter enough for you to risk something important. As David listened to Isabella speak, he realized that his decision had created a legacy far more meaningful than any piece of mountain property could have provided. The scared 12-year-old, who had once worried about losing her home, had become a confident young woman who understood that strength came from helping others find their own strength. Maria was now planning to study music therapy, wanting to use her voice to help children heal from trauma. Carlos, at 11, was already tutoring younger children in piano and showing them that talent combined with opportunity could overcome almost any obstacle. Block 11. 5 years after selling his grandfather's land, David received a letter that brought his story full circle in a way he had never expected. The envelope, addressed in careful handwriting, contained a cashier's check for $13,000 and a note from Isabella, now 18 and preparing to attend college on a full academic scholarship. "Dear Rabbi David," the letter began, "I have been saving money from part-time jobs for 3 years, and Grandma Elena has been contributing everything she could spare from her salary. We will never be able to repay the gift you gave our family, but we can ensure that you have the means to help another family the way you helped us." Elena had included her own note, written in the careful English she had been studying at the community center's adult education program. "My rabbi friend, you gave us home, but more important, you gave us hope. Now we give back so other family can have same chance. This money comes with love and prayer that God bless you like you blessed us." The gesture was overwhelming in its generosity and its symbolism. A family that had once been in desperate need was now in a position to help others avoid the same crisis they had faced. David used the money exactly as Elena and Isabella had intended. Within 6 months, he had helped 2 other families avoid foreclosure, contributed to a fund that provided emergency assistance for single mothers, and established a small scholarship program for immigrant children pursuing education. Each act of assistance created its own ripples of positive change, just as his original decision had done. But the greatest reward came from knowing that his choice to sacrifice his family's property had created something more valuable than anything he could have preserved. Elena's grandchildren had learned that stability and opportunity were gifts to be shared rather than hoarded. They understood that their success carried with it the responsibility to lift others up in return. The mountain cabin was gone, but the values it had represented, family, continuity, and connection to something larger than oneself, lived on in 3 young people who would carry those principles into their own futures. As David sat in his office on a quiet Sunday morning, reading thank you notes from families who had been helped by the fund Isabella and Elena had established, he felt his grandfather's presence as strongly as he ever had in the mountain cabin. Abraham Goldstein had taught his grandson that true wealth couldn't be measured in property or possessions, but in the number of lives touched by acts of selfless love. The land was gone, but the legacy was flourishing in ways that no piece of property could ever match. CTA ending. Rabbi David's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest inheritances are the ones we choose to give away. His willingness to sacrifice what he valued most created a ripple effect of hope that continues to this day. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel to hear more tales of ordinary people making extraordinary sacrifices for others. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story of faith, family, and the courage to put others' needs before our own. In the comments below, share your thoughts about sacrifice and community. What would you be willing to give up to help a neighbor in need? And please, let us know what country you're listening from. More inspiring stories of human kindness are coming soon.